Scandal and the media. Some say it's a union made in heaven. Some say it's the devil when he's hardest at work. My name is Ben Aronoff, and in a moment we're going to look at the power of one form of media, the newspaper, and remember a case that gripped the nation and the world exactly 50 years ago. The murder trial of Dr. Sam Sheppard. Trial by newspaper. In 1954, we were watching movies like The Caine Mutiny, Dial M for Murder. We were listening to Bill Haley and the Comets, shaking, rattling, rolling. M&M's with peanuts, melts in your mouth, not in your hand. Sports Illustrated was born, 1954. Brown versus the Board of Education. Elvis Presley recorded his first album. But a much more ominous event occurred. Marilyn Sheppard was murdered in her own bed, and her well-respected husband, Dr. Sam Sheppard, was accused of the crime. It threw his family into turmoil they never recovered from, and the nation was fascinated, hypnotized with the case. The crime was horrific by anyone's standards. Blood splattered everywhere. Disarray and chaos in every corner of the room. A beautiful woman's body lay motionless in her bed. A frightened and confused young boy, Sam Reese Sheppard, son of Dr. and Mrs. Sheppard, awakened and whisked past the room where his mother lay dead. At the time, young Sam was an average 7-year-old, toys, a puppy he adored, and a life of privilege. I caught up with him at his residence where he answered some very tough questions about then and now.
And I was awakened by two strangers in my bedroom who were shaking me awake. And that was kind of frightening. Didn't know what was happening. They were in a panic. It turned out one was my uncle, Richard, and the other was a neighbor's wife, the mayor's wife, Mrs. Houck, who I didn't recognize at the time, really, and they told me something awful had happened. I had to get up out of bed. I didn't have time to change out of my pajamas, and they scooped up some clothes and ushered me to the doorway into the hallway where a policeman was standing to my right, and he kind of stood up and blocked my view into the next room. That was the murder room. And I kind of pointed, and I think that's when the flash bulbs went off in my face for the first time. And I somehow, I think right at that threshold, somehow intuitionally I knew my world, universe had kind of tipped upside down. Somehow, just intuitionally, I knew something was terribly, terribly wrong.
Even though I've spoken with Sam innumerable times in the past, his candor in relating the events of that night still provoke incomprehensible revelations. A lot for a 7-year-old to digest.
If I had awakened, it's quite possible I would have been killed too.
Understandably, Sam has blocked from his memory much of what went on that night. When we return, the coroner, the police, the newspapers, and Dr. Sheppard all went on trial. The American justice system itself was about to face critical scrutiny. Quit stalling and bring him in.
Yeah, that's a front page headline editorial.
And that was July also.
Yeah. Yeah, that was to arrest him.
Sam was a bit of a gadabout. On the other hand, he was the police surgeon for Bay Village. And I think that whoever killed Marilyn and whoever was with Marilyn at the time that the killing took place, not Sam, believed that he was out on police business when the murder occurred because he had left on a light before he fell asleep downstairs, which usually was left on when he had to go out at night, just to let people know that he wasn't home and to let his wife know if she woke up.
Pretty soon there were 3, 4 different agencies on the crime scene trampling on it, nobody in charge, nobody knowing what was happening, so confused that some high school kids were able to go upstairs and see my mother in her deathbed in a murder scene. Just outrageous, outrageous.
From that morning on, the life of a relatively average family ended. The happy times together, the travels out west and beyond were no more. The get-togethers with friends were a thing of the past. Dr. Sam was in deep trouble, and the smiles on the family's faces were replaced with nightmarish exhibits of terror. There were absolutely no familiarities, nothing to grasp and hold on to that would help make sense of what was happening and what was lost. When we return, 100 days of headlines. In hindsight, it seemed so obvious that the Sheppard case had serious flaws. Why didn't anyone try and stop the onslaught? Why weren't more questions asked about the circus atmosphere? Emotion seemed to rule over common sense. Influential people, judges, Supreme Court judges, publishers, politicians, all became blinded by their own lust for power and made the judicial system nothing more than a mockery, a caricature of itself. Just to be re-elected?
And included in that minority were 2 justices of the Ohio Supreme Court who said, and they had no political fears, the names were Hart and Taft, both bigger than the Scripps-Howard newspaper chain. They said the state proved Sheppard innocent with its own evidence. That's a very strong dissent.
From the very morning of the murder, the coroner pointed his finger of guilt towards Dr. Sam, and the search for another possible suspect ended.
The coroner finally came from downtown Cleveland, and he took the local authorities aside, some of whom were friends of my dad's, people who he had ridden in their cars to emergencies with. They had a meeting, and we have the documentation now, finally, after many years, that he took them to City Hall, met with them, and said, "We know who did it. The doctor did it. Don't worry, we're going to get him." So from that point to this day, that county has never, ever investigated anybody else.
They were driven by the coroner, who was a little man, an MD, who did not like the Sheppard family. I don't think he liked anyone. I had him on the witness stand, and he just made a total fool of himself.
Many years before the Sheppard case, Judge Webster Thayer sent 2 innocent men to their death while the world watched with complacency. We believed the judge because of his position, when in reality, it was his position which ended up being as destructive as the heavy blade of the guillotine itself, crashing down with an almost eerie silence. Dr. Sam knelt symbolically under the same blade, and once again, our judicial system, our newspaper, our politicians severed him from his freedom and ignored the canon, innocent until proven guilty. The media, the newspapers record their good points and, in the Sheppard case, their mistakes, for history to be the ultimate judge.
You know, initially it was a clinical approach. Sure, I'll supervise a lie detector test. He'd asked for one before, been granted, and then the last minute the governor turned him down. And I talked to the governor about that while he was still in office. And it was very plain to me that he had been intimidated by the Cleveland Press, the dominant newspaper in the state, and perhaps the lead paper in the Scripps-Howard chain, but it was well known they could make or break political figures with the newspaper, and did so. That was the paper that had crucified Sam Sheppard, not only with false stories, but with editorials urging the jury to convict, something you would never see today, partly due to this case.